the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, consider tossing us $1 a month at patreon.com/MUHH, or perhaps consider leaving us a nice iTunes review, perhaps something again like Explain Deleuze to Me. Taylor and I are very proud to bring you all Jon Roffe, currently at the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy. He has recently co-translated Raymond Rouet's The Genesis of Living Forms and has published books on Badiou's Deleuze, A Guide to Deleuze's Empiricism and Subjectivity, a book on the philosophy of the market entitled Abstract Market Theory, and most recently a book on the works of Gilles Deleuze from 1953 to 1969. Jon, welcome to the Happy Hour. And I just want to say, first of all, that the Abstract Markets Philosophy book was amazing. It was really good. I've very thoroughly enjoyed that work. So kudos to you for
I
your hard
appreciate
work.
it. Thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk with you about all these great thinkers.
We always like to do this, and this is kind of a good way to get into the show. You mentioned a little bit about an encounter. Was it Graham Jonas? I forget. You mentioned this encounter with Salman Maimon's philosophy that introduced you to Deleuze, but do you mind giving us kind of a broader account for your first memories, an anecdote about sort of getting into philosophy and sort of getting inspired to sort of take on that route and that engagement, and further, why Deleuze, or how did Deleuze become so important for you?
Sure, of course. My friend Graham Jones, who you mentioned there, that particular encounter and conversation was well after my initial run-in with philosophy. I effectively began studying philosophy as an undergraduate in an anthropology course. And the first philosopher who I really encountered there was Michel Foucault. Obviously a fairly unorthodox figure in a certain respect, but that was the gateway for me in through anthropology and Foucault. And Foucault led me to Lyotard, and then Deleuze, and then Derrida. It was just sort of a sequence that I ended up following off of my own bat, I suppose, just in reading, and there wasn't anything traumatic about this, which is a shame because, I kind of agree with Deleuze that thought begins in trauma. It was instead a sense of my first experience is very Platonic and almost embarrassingly Aristotelian, the experience of wonder. Wonder in, I think, Plato's sense rather than Aristotle's like tepid sense.
Right.
Perplexity, but also just a sense of a very Nietzschean kind of sense of joy and power.
Yeah.
That the feeling of being a bird of prey, fundamentally. Not in the moral sense, but in the sense of just being suddenly free to think. And thought itself being this vector or power that was more than me, and caught me up in a movement. And so that's my kind of the primal scene of my encounter with philosophy. A positive one, but since then it's been, it's descended into misery and perplexity in a more kind of substantive way. Since then, not really thanks to these four figures who were, as a friend of mine likes to joke, my forefathers. Derrida, Deleuze, but just the philosophy is difficult. And the social and institutional context today in philosophy is menacing and demoralizing. And so the sequence that I just outlined was the sequence of my own reading fundamentally and drifting attention. I studied an honours year in Australia anyway. The honours year is like a fourth year at the end of a bachelor's degree. Honours year writing about Derrida and translation.
Oh.
And I was kind of fixated. I was a good Derridian monk in But then, like the literal night that I submitted my thesis, on Derrida, I drifted through a very famous bookshop here in Melbourne called Readings and thought, well, I've got like $15 in my bank account still. Can I get a book to celebrate?
Right.
And Deleuze's little book on Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, was just within reach. And that was the beginning of the end of my monastic Derridian existence, basically.
Yeah. That's a good place to start with him. I mean, it reads differently from a lot of his other books on individual philosophers. It's kind of put together in an interesting way that is unique, right? I mean, it has a glossary. It's got these interestingly different parts. It really is less of the buggery going on, and there's perhaps, I mean, maybe there's some of it still, but there's more of an expositional tone. Do you have a feeling about that, that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite right. It begins with this amazing biography of Spinoza,
right?
Like 6 or 7 pages, which ends with this. I still find it just like cripplingly moving to this day. Reading this, him talking about Spinoza's rejection of the negative.
Yes.
Against Hegel's critique of Spinoza that he did not discover the power of the negative, he had enough faith in affirmation and the positive, and then reiterates this kind of beautiful ethical sort of Spinoza-Nietzsche equation idea of the thing that Spinoza was against everything that denigrated life.
Yes.
Idea. I mean, it still hits me like a truck reading this today. And I think it's the fundamental component of Deleuze's significance to me as a philosopher is this ethical moment, which is not saying much because it's sort of one of the things that is most prominent, I think, in reading Deleuze. It's a wonderful little book. It's amazing. Yeah.
This is something that we talked to with Daniel Smith about, when Deleuze passed, Michel Serre, he's reflecting on this. This is one of those moments that hits me like a truck too, where he's like, there's no way Deleuze would have done that. He wouldn't have committed suicide. He went to get a breath of fresh air, something like this, because it's totally against his philosophy of affirmation. And we learned in that discussion was that, Dan had an encounter with a pulmonary specialist, and the fact that a lot of these medical wards either have their windows barred or they're on the first floor precisely because this is a common occurrence. And that was something that I didn't know. And that, because for the longest time, besides Serre's quasi-sentimental reflections on Deleuze's untimely death, it kind of always had been talked about as a suicide. But, putting that in context and thinking about his philosophy, as you're saying, not that one can't choose to do such a thing, but that it seems that little tidbit, that little anecdote, which probably is based in some sort of fact, that kind of reiterates your point about this continual, commitment to kind of affirmation.
Not to get into the weeds too much, but I mean, I'm not convinced by that Serre's kind of concern. I think Dan's point is quite right. Obviously, it's a revelation to me, learning these medical facts. But I mean, I'm drawn to think of the remarks about suicide by Spinoza, in Book 4 of the Ethics, where he says basically suicide's impossible, because that would be an act that is destroy the self, but the self is by definition a striving to persist. It would be Deleuze degree zero. He was the last things that he was capable of. It's not suicide per se, it's simply the ending of the trajectory of action.
I like that. That's well said, because you're right, because there's a passivity, there's that reactive force to it that seems, as you said, rightly, that would contradict this principle, the conatos, or however you want to put it.
Right, exactly, yeah. Obviously, the word suicide is very loaded.
Yes.
In this context too. I mean, the other person I think of is Hume, who wrote probably the only really pro-suicide tract in the history of modern Western philosophy. And it's quite beautiful what Hume says, which is like, there's no downside to this. If life has got terrible for you and for the people around you, well then, it's an act of joyfulness and ease almost for Hume. Now, again, like we're talking about suicide, which is an extremely complicated issue in many different directions, but we should start our discussion with something, chipper. And
now that we've got that out of the way,
enough philosophy to sadden, right?
Yeah. Right. That actually is a good. That was one of the, before we get to Cooper's question, that was one of the follow-ups I had, was as the epigraph you choose. This is a kind of phrase that the point that Deleuze makes, I see it reiterated a lot, and you put it as kind of the epigraph for your volume, the volume 1 of the works of Gilles Deleuze. This notion that philosophy that doesn't sadden anyone, that it's not worth anything. I've talked to friends about this, where the stupidity that is supposed to be harmed is not necessarily the same thing as, for example, the transcendental idiot or things like this. There's something, I wonder about your take on this line about philosophy's role is to sadden, it's to harm stupidity, and how you read that. I think of it as a kind of a celebrated, famous quote from Nietzsche in philosophy. Do you have a take on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very striking, first of all, that Deleuze would say anything like this in a book that's sort of like bent against the figure of the negative.
Right.
He's just perpetually hammering on Hegel, negativity, slave morality. And then right in the middle of the book, the only use of philosophy is to sadden, attrister. I had to look up the French because I was sure that it had been mistranslated. But why put it at the front of this book? Well, in part as a challenge, a challenge to our habits of reading Deleuze. Like one of the problems with reading Deleuze is that you get this sense, or you learn and you read that Deleuze is about affirmation and living. And that's a way of sometimes avoiding some of the things that he says about sadness, about harming, about the death drive.
Yeah.
The first half of his work, And so I put it there in a way as a kind of way of refreshing the palate, if I can put it like that, so that we can come back to Deleuze fresh and setting some of our presuppositions aside. That was part of the idea. The other is that, it to me is the only universally acceptable definition of philosophy. Anyone that disagrees with that, I don't want to talk to that person at all ever again. That's the end of the conversation. Now, you rightly point out that the issue of stupidity is complicated, right?
Yes.
Here, Deleuze uses the same word here, bêtise.
Yes.
Animality, as he does in difference and repetition. But in difference and repetition, as you say, there's two senses to the word stupidity, right?
Yes.
One is this kind of the stupidity of opinion, doxa, and the other is this transcendental stupidity of thought. So thought really has these two poles of stupidity. We tend to just daily move through the stupidity of opinion, no thinking. And then when we have an encounter with something that forces us to think, we're flung into the other direction, and that now we are gripped with the fact that there is no thinking yet. I must think, and yet I cannot. This kind of like moment of the genesis of thought, So thought, there's two kinds of idiots. One of them is easier to deal with than the other, but thinking, insofar as it exists, begins with this second transcendental sense of the idiot. It's kind of interesting and complicated structure, of a sort of a psychogenetic structure, if you like.
I like how you put this, because it calls into question some of these received notions that we get from, at the very least, from Descartes and Kant, right, on good sense and common sense, as though thinking were sort of universally possessed and sort of well distributed, and as though it were a thing that doesn't really need to be, that one has to presuppose sort of as a faculty. Whereas Deleuze is calling that into question because it is for him about isolating this genetic element. That's one of the keys that, at least again in this early work, that's one of the keys that is put to the foreground, is the transcendental idiot does have this positive function as opposed to a purely negative one. So that's kind of what I was thinking about with harming stupidity, where the stupidity would be that of opinion, but also that of what would be states of dominant powers that obviously would, just as a side, I think of Charles I, I believe, either did or wanted to outlaw coffee houses that were becoming popular because caffeine stimulates, it gets people talking, and then ideas start to be generated. And so, think you can't let people think too much. I guess that was kind of why I like that you put that at the front of your book. And it is kind of to call into question that we already sort of know. We already have the presuppositions, objective or subjective, about what it means to think, what it means to philosophize, even what Deleuze is doing.
I think that's very important to recognize, that just reading Deleuze or going to a Deleuze study conference doesn't sort of like make you immune to the stupidity he's talking about. It's another possible form of it, Now, look, this does actually bring us back to one of your earlier questions about Maimon, sort of the next step, I suppose, that I put that thing at the front of the book also as a reproach to myself, really, for having gone along with a certain kind of cliched image of Deleuze for such a long time. And as you mentioned in the introduction to that book, I shout out my friend Graham Jones, who is a wonderful Deleuze scholar and unfortunately little known today. His PhD thesis, which I think submitted in 2002, was just this kind of still like material in it that people are catching up with.
Interesting.
It's sort of oriented around the conviction that there is this kind of Maimonian, Solomon Maimon core to Deleuze's project in difference and repetition. And what makes that stand out, Maimon, is this genetic ambition that you've just touched on.
Yes.
Deleuze is a post-Kantian transcendental genetic thinker inspired by Maimon. For a long time, I used to quip that if you understand Maimon and Freud, you're pretty much going to have a handle on all of Deleuze up to 69. And I think that's basically still true. I mean, Maimon packs in, Kant, packs in Leibniz and the calculus, packs in Spinoza, but with this genetic accent or ambition.
It's interesting, too, that I believe Kant read and at least in letters discussed Maimon's work and was fascinated, but perhaps not necessarily convinced, or maybe was repressing a little bit about this thinker that might have already challenged his system, kind of right in the midst of it.
No, I mean, that's true. Kant was subject to a hail of criticism when the Critique of Reason came out, and his friend Marcus Hertz sends him a copy of Maimon's essay on transcendental philosophy, and Kant is getting old at this point and probably didn't like his friend sending him a giant unsolicited book in the mail. But he replies with a letter saying, "Nobody has understood my work so well as mine." Right. So it is very strange that he's one of the figures that's fallen out of circulation. I think he's a remarkable, very idiosyncratic philosopher, but remarkable. The other thing to say about Maimon, of course, is that he did for a living what many philosophers are going to be doing for a living from here on in, which is sit in pubs, and if people bought him drinks, he would talk philosophy with them.
I mean, honestly, that sounds living the dream. If you can,
it's not too bad.
If you can reduce your desires enough to sort of just have that kind of conviviality, which, as Cooper and I this is one of the reasons for our little assemblage.
Yeah, I mean, machinic unconscious happy hour, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's.
It fits perfectly. Yeah.
I was trying to describe this to Cooper that it reminds me of, after you mentioned conferences, it reminds me of after the conference, little cohorts of individuals go out to the pub, to the bar and get drinks. And that's kind of where a lot of the real fun occurs. That's when you can kind of let loose some of the affectation, whatever you want to call it, the prim and properness. You can let your hair down and you can kind of discuss ideas in a little bit a more informal way, but also sometimes unexpected encounters can happen there where you won't necessarily get them from not all, but most conference questions. A lot of, I don't know if this is still the thing, hopefully it's fallen out of fashion, but a lot of conference questions that I have heard and seen are posturing and let's talk about my thing.
It's horrible. It's disgusting. Yeah, actually. No good. I agree. I mean, the real conference is always what's in the shadow of the conference.
Yes.
The academic, institutional masturbation. Disgusting.
Cooper had a good question that I wasn't thinking about, but I thought that it would be worth jumping into abstract market theory. As Cooper said, he really enjoyed that book. And I thought that I was blown away by thinking about Meillassoux, for example, or Ruwer in this context. And I loved that. But Coop, take over, my good friend.
Perhaps we should even start out by excavating perhaps the genesis of why you decided to tackle this project for starters.
If you ask yourself, what is the market as a philosopher? I mean, I literally had nothing. I thought it's complete emptiness. But it always bugged me. It's a bit akin to the way that people talk about the economy, in media. What are they talking about? Exactly. So that's half of it, right? And the other half was that I had some friends who were working in a management and marketing department, if you can believe that, at the University of Melbourne, who were coming to my Deleuze seminars. And they were like, okay, we want to work on the market. You interested in that at all? Funny you say that. And so that kind of worked out really well. I ended up getting a really wonderful postgrad fellowship in this faculty of management and marketing, and was around all of these people who were working on the history of economics and sort of actor network theory and the social studies of finance, these kinds of, let's say, sociological modes of investigation of economics.
Right.
And so that was extremely rich I guess the third thing would be my encounter with the work of Eli Ayash.
Yeah.
It's kind of central to the setting the project up. And he's a philosopher, but he works at a derivatives software firm based on ITO 33 in Paris that writes software for banks to use in pricing and trading derivatives. And so his book, The Blank Swan, B-L-A-N-K, The Blank Swan, gave me the first kind of step in the right direction.
I think what I really enjoy about the book was how you sort of apply all these Deleuzian concepts to the market. It really just kind of helps ground them for someone like myself who's still in my philosophical apprenticeship, let's say.
Well, I mean, that never finishes, right?
Yeah, true, right.
Unfortunately.
Indeed. Along with that, I think my first question was that I've been sort of wrestling with today was, would you consider the market or markets rather to be like an abstract machine, or would it be more like an assemblage? Because my take was, it feels like, again, being somewhat of a novice with Deleuze, because there's what's the primary function of the market would be to calculate price ultimately. So I think that lends itself to at least the appearance of a type of machinism, but I'm not so well grounded there.
I suppose there are a number of ways of coming at this. Maybe the most sort of straightforward way would be this, to say that I think that when we talk about price, we need to distinguish three moments of price. And these have a connection to temporal modalities as well. But first of all, there is the writing of price, which is the act of pricing something. This can be done by anybody who is, let's say in shorthand, who occupies a certain social position of some kind. Not just anybody can write a price for something, although increasingly today we have access to trading apps, for instance, that will allow us to write prices. Anyway, so there is the act of writing price, first of all, which takes place in the present. Price then is inscribed. And the main, as it were, kind of being of price, in my view, is as inscription. It's recorded. It's recorded, I would say, inscribed in the surface of the market. And there's the kind of chapters, I think 3 and 4 of the book, are trying to work out what does it mean to say that a price can be inscribed in the market.
Right.
So that price, sort of, as it were, is latent. It insists or subsists at that level as a kind of memory of pricing, if I can put it like that. Then there's the third moment, which is what I call the realization of price. May not be a good word. When we see a price, for instance, even if we just go into a supermarket and you see the price of milk on the shelf, we take the price there in terms of value. So we realize the price as value, or we could say, I think, we misrecognize price as value. We, as embedded in a social practice, we can't treat price as pure quantity. So when we confront it, we, as it were, interpret it, make sense of it in terms of value. And this, to me, is one of the constitutive functions of capitalism, is to systematically obscure the difference between price and value. And that's not necessarily a strictly negative thing. It's sort of productive in its way. It forces us. The price, in this sense, is like a problem in Deleuze's sense. We're forced to resolve the problem, to make sense of it. And in this sense, the price sort of opens up towards the future, because it adds something to our experience of social reality that can't be made sense of in current terms. We have to create a value for the price. And this is the third mode, if you like. And this is obviously just going on all the time. All three of these things parallel with one another. I suppose that's one way of sort of summarizing it. Where does the assemblage come into the picture? I think I'd have to say that we can identify social reality, the society, as an assemblage, but that the kind of inscriptive moment is what writes on the surface of the market is effectively a kind of abstract machine, to use these terms. However, that said, I really am very reticent to use the phrase abstract machine, war machine, and in particular, I want to get away from any sense that we're dealing with something that's ideal here. There is a kind of materiality to all of this. It's not virtual, it's intensive. Yeah. So I don't know if that clarifies anything, but that's sort of one way of putting the project of the book.
Now, when Cooper and I were discussing this either or, which may be restrictive, but it's an interesting thought experiment, I kind of had the idea that markets seem more like an assemblage insofar as, I believe it's in the micropolitics, the segmentary plateau, the ninth one, I think. I'm trying to remember. They are discussing Gabriel Tard, and they kind of are discussing his innovations against someone like Durkheim, who's focusing on these macro representations, right? And Gabriel Tard is focusing on these little innovations in bureaucracy, et cetera. But they have this claim that beliefs and desires are like the two aspects of every assemblage. And I was kind of thinking on a very broad, superficial level, like what goes into something like markets and pricing and in values, all these different things are kind of these confused movements of beliefs and desires. But again, this is kind of superficial and was just for fun. I didn't know if you had a reaction to that. And if not, then, it's something that can be left aside. But there is obviously at least some play of beliefs and desires going on, right?
Yes. It's worth talking about this because beliefs and desires are kind of two elements of what we could call orthodox economic thought today, but
interesting,
really, a version of neoclassical economics, the rational actor kind of approach to things. So I think it's important to challenge the conceptions of beliefs and desires that we get in that kind of idiotic kind of subjectivity. Now, that said, I don't know. That's all I have to say. I could speculate, but I'm not sure how to bring the tide in, other than to say I think that there has to be an emphasis on the genetic element, in my view, like what engenders beliefs and desires, in the sense that Todd is using the word.
Right.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a good question.
I guess that's why I was in some of my other questions. Although again, it was maybe privileging the fact that you've written extensively on Deleuze's first book, or at least his first singly authored book on empiricism and subjectivity, where Hume is thinking through the sort of genesis of beliefs and how they, there's this sense in which we believe too many things, right? On the one hand, I don't have to reiterate all that, but I guess that's maybe why I was skewed in that direction and thinking about how, there is this kind of monstrous aspect of markets that involve us in this play, this whole, even with something as banal like inflation, there's all this movement towards this investment of prices going up and down, the worth of dollar, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of banal. I guess it was more of like a lay person take or whatever. It was just a fun little thought experiment.
The Hume connection is interesting, not least because Hume was one of the more important writers on economic thought in that period, even though his account of, let's say, money is like wrong, disavowed today. It is very interesting the way that he brings economics into his philosophical account of society. I have to give that idea of belief in economic practice a bit more thought, I feel.
No, that's completely fine, and it is interesting though. Just to speak of money, I mean, it's recently we've been going through Anti-Oedipus chapter by chapter, and they're very clear about the insertion of an abstract equivalent like money into markets that previously weren't sort of decoded by it. It basically ruins the relative autonomy of those different modes of exchange and overcodes them and sort of it just kind of ruins things, right? To a certain extent.
I think, the second book, the second book on economics that I'm kind of slowly working on is focused on money. The relationship between money and memory is sort of the central.
That's interesting. It is interesting, too, that you kind of preface your book on abstract market theory with pulling from someone like Simmel, who has a philosophy of money where he's like, it's not an economic investigation, it's a philosophical one. And you kind of adopt that terminology, too, for abstract market theory, that you're interested in a philosophical approach to the market. And one of the criteria that you bring to it are two axioms. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about this.
Sure.
This notion of, what is it? The first one is like an axiom of methodological imminence. I believe it's something like this. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about your criteria, your axioms?
I mean, the reason why they're stated as axioms is, it's sort of, if I can put it this way, pedagogical. There's a great resistance that I was feeling coming from the point of view of the sociology of economics. Basically, it wanted to reduce all meaningful reflection on economic practice to a sociological matter of observation. In other words, and this is a broader issue, there's a kind of one strand of contemporary social thinking that aims to marginalize and eventually eject philosophy from any legitimacy. It's sort of reflected in this movement towards so-called the ontological turn, in anthropology, for instance.
Interesting.
The identification of philosophy with colonialism, basically. Now, it's a whole complicated issue. Obviously, there are colonial aspects to philosophy that are quite profound, but let's just bracket all of that. It's the whole thing. So the reason why I started by posing these axioms was to kind of, as circuit breakers, to say there is a philosophical approach that I'm doing, and I'm going to crystallize it in these axioms. And the first axiom, the one that you mentioned, of methodological imminence, is really just, in my view, to say, okay, I'm doing philosophy now, which is to say my engagement with the market is to form a concept of it without mediating this conceptual creation through social practice or sociological perspective.
Right.
I'm not going to be looking for, in other words, empirical justification. This is not what philosophy is interested in. So it's sort of what's that metaphor? Nailing my colors to the mast, like saying, okay, we're going to stop invoking the social as the mediator between the knower and the known.
Right.
We're just going to think philosophically. Now, if you don't think that's possible, and some people don't, then that's fine. But, it's time for you to get off the boat at that point.
There is a value to it because precisely it would be, if you didn't do that, you would be begging the question, at least with one of your interventions in the different conflations that you're trying to diagnose as a problem, right? Particularly price and value, the market versus markets, and what is it? The market and the social, something like this, like these three conflations. If you were to already bring in the social as a means of investigation, you'd kind of be begging the question.
That's it. Yeah. So that's what that axiom means, is exactly what you've just said. We've got to stop doing this. Otherwise, the market itself will be forever obscured.
And self-justifying, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. 100%. If you look at the way that the sociology of knowledge, people, active network theory basically approach issues is to exclude a priori, ironically enough, the capacity for a concept to be decisive.
It gets us back to kind of Deleuze's point about, there is this kind of naive idea about knowledge and problems, that problems are kind of given to us on a standardized test to solve, rather than the true power being in formulating the problems.
There it is. That's exactly right. The other way to put it, I think, or let's say a complementary way, is to say that philosophy can be transcendental, which is to say that the things that we are interested in are not always observable, to use one word that was kicked around a lot by these sociologists, that there are conditions for observability as such that we can investigate. And this is the philosophical move, or one way of putting it in any case, that the sociological approach forecloses. To me, in a way, that the conclusion of the book is a good summary of, I think there's an obvious value to sociology and history and so on, but we have to understand that they are discrete forms of investigation unrelated to philosophy. And philosophy itself is concerned with form. It's kind of formal investigation.
This is good. And just a last question, before not to belabor the point, but the second axiom that follows, I just wonder about, you kind of say that everything that belongs to the market is going to be sort of at stake here. I wondered, I wasn't exactly sure maybe why that was necessary to state after the methodological imminence, but perhaps you can kind of unpack exactly what you mean by that. And I suppose the follow-up, if you would rather kind of say that it does necessarily follow, what exactly abstract means to you. And I believe I had the quote here. It was something about but it was something about the real. I don't mean to. Yeah. I'll let you speak in your own terms. I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
The real on its own terms. There it is. Okay, thank you.
What I mean by abstraction in the book, and I don't want to go much further than simply what I say here. I don't want to tangle with Hegel.
Sure.
But I mean by it precisely what the first axiom indicates, which is, the abstraction is not sort of like, as it were, kind of drawing away from something. It's separating out something from these kind of other factors. It's a process of rarefaction or bracketing or the transcendental move, depending on all of those things, quite correct in their way. The secondary axiom, I think that it's sort of derivative from the first one, but it's meant to indicate that a lot of people who approach the question of the market take one or some phenomena and treat them as definitive. Leave things out. Yeah. I mean, it's the same kind of gesture that we find in Kant, that we're just going to focus on everyday, me walking around the town every day in the afternoon. This is going to be the paradigmatic nature of first-person experience, what Deleuze calls tracing. And that's the same thing that happens. So Ayash is one person that does it and says only human beings can write prices. That's clearly not true. Algorithms can write prices. In kind of neoclassical economics, there's this kind of idiot idea that money is irrelevant in market processes. It's so shocking that I want to repeat it because even I about this. There is no theory of money in neoclassical economics. None. Which is like fucking insane.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me swearing on
No, please do. I love it.
So, that's another example. It's unjustifiable, the exclusion. So there are these kind of a priori exclusions that get made that I wanted to push back on. I mean, Ayash example is the one that I foreground in the book, this exclusion of algorithmic pricing. But
and that seems strange because that's something that he does for a living, right? Or that's something at least
that's right.
Or at least that's something that he facilitates or is working. It's not almost like he's too close to it, right? That he and the exclusion you're talking about, the exclusion of a theory of money from neoclassical economics, it also seems like another one of those presuppositions that we just mentioned, right? It's just, of course we have money. Let's not even bother with that. That doesn't even need to be said, but that's a contingent phenomenon, right?
That's right. It tells us nothing about economic processes to consider money whatsoever. Paul Samuelson, the infamous economist, he says that basically capitalism is a complicated form of a barter relationship, which is insane.
Yes.
Insane. And completely explains nothing,
It's another naturalizing, self-justifying move to do something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of perverse in a certain way, right?
Yes. That's right. It is. Yeah. Perverse is a good word for it. Yeah. I mean, as for Ayash, God bless him. He's basically a kind of a market existentialist, if I can put it that way. The market maker is the hero, it's the Sartre pour soi, that's sort of like, despite all of the contextual factors, all of the in itself, is going to say, I choose thus, right price. And that's why an algorithm can't do it, because they are not, as it were, the heroes of pricing.
They're the NPCs.
Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty strange. I think that's really underlying his thought in a way that he hasn't really reflected on. But anyway,
this is all
love
good.
That guy, but it's very strange to see this kind of heroic narrative cast around the market maker.
I guess that's to not heroicize it would force one to perhaps take on a slightly more critical vein, a slightly more condemnatory aspect, because there is a lot that is not very laudable. Obviously, we don't have to get into that. That seems like a kind of a self-evidence that.
I actually was thinking about this question earlier today, reflecting on one of the other questions that you two have posed about my use of the example of gun legislation in the book on Hume. I know this seems completely unrelated, but bear with me.
No, please. I was curious because I was thinking a little, not to cut you off or the foreground, but I was thinking about Australia's unique way of dealing with this issue, and I hoped you would say something about that.
I can't remember what great act of gun violence provoked me to use that example in the book when I was writing it. In 2018, I guess. It can't have been that. 2015, whatever.
There's so many. It's easy to kind of not be able to separate them.
So it was obviously a moment of fury and despair that led me to write it, even in that anodyne way that I introduced it there. I put that in that book. This is just the, let's say, warm up to my main point. Sorry, this is so convoluted. I put it in the book great. Because it's a way of, it was a way for me of foregrounding what I find completely unacceptable in Hume's social and political thought, which is
interesting.
His incapacity to reflect on the nature of violence, basically. And so the account I give there is what Hume would say, on Deleuze's view, what Hume would say about guns, which is that the use of guns and the meaning of firearms in a society is kind of it's a matter of ongoing the production of social norms and practices. It's completely positive. There's no negativity in this. It's just like shifting practices of different kinds. But to come back to what we were talking about before, I mean, I think fundamentally one of the important things about Deleuze's relationship to social thought, let's say, is that it, despite wanting to abjure any reference to negativity, it's always got room for a theory of violence.
Interesting.
It's pretty clear in Nancy Oedipus, each form of socius involves a violence of its own kind. And that includes the kind of violences that, to come back to what started all of this, includes those forms of violences that attend a market-based capitalist society. These very strange indirect forms of violence alongside the most shocking forms of murder.
Yeah.
as they kind of memorably put it in What is Philosophy, there is no there's no social democracy. It was not called for people to fire on people in the ghettos, and that's simply a fact.
Yeah.
And that's something that Hume could only incorporate as one variation in social reality. And I think that's the wrong way to look at the question of violence, basically.
It seems like Hume would, if property is one of those sort of norms that we build up the social relation from, then it seems like he would be siding with some Second Amendment kind of fundamentalist views that, maybe disregarding the well-formed militia aspect and focusing on the second part, that of course that you have to begin with private property in order to build these and so, but that's interesting too, because, and I don't mean to digress too much, and we can sort of finish up this topic here, but I was thinking about how you point out that Hume, and Deleuze maybe even points this out if I remember correctly, that Hume proceeds differently than someone like Hobbes or Rousseau in a sort of negative idea of society and institutions. But you're pointing out this problem that Hume's kind of not solved, at least not really addressed very well, which this kind of makes him a little bit more like Hobbes if he can't deal with violence in this way, because it does seem like gun ownership then would be back to the kind of state of nature, the war of all against all, something like that, right?
Right. Well, I think what he would say is that he's never going to allow that kind of move. I think what he would say is that, Hume is a conservative thinker, but I don't think we could say that he's any kind of originalist in this sense, because the meaning of something like, since we're talking about the Constitution, is itself kind of changing as social norms and practices change. There's no sense in gesturing back 50 years to recall another important date at the moment in the debates around the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Because the important thing is the kind of like ongoing foundation movement of social practices, how they reinforce and cut across and modify one another.
Right.
Yeah. So there is this kind of, as you say, you emphasize the issue of property, and that's really the basic thing, like for Hume. The first right, if I can put it that way, the first kind of fundamental social fixture is property ownership, and that this underpins all other kind of social norms and practices.
Right.
We can't have society without private property, basically. So that's obviously extremely conservative. It's got we're not talking about Marx here. What's
interesting, though, it does seem like in the wake of Hume, not just obviously Kant and the dogmatic slumber and all these other things, but you do see in the next century a kind of, or at least at the end of that century, a flourishing of sort of utopian ideas that would call into question this very notion. And I think that this is part of one of the benefits of chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus, with historicizing and doing a genealogy of different forms of social machines and ways of organizing, is precisely calling into question this seemingly basic fact or axiom that you have to have private property to have a society or a socius. And I think that that's obviously a kind of historical blind spot, right, for Hume.
The problem, of course, is not if that is true. Let's recall, he was most famous in his life for writing a massive history of England. And it's also because of the way that Hume understands experience. An object is a kind of stabilized collection of impressions and ideas.
Right.
So that kind of stability is built into his epistemology, and it comes to inform his social ontology, if you like.
That's good.
Stability and stable production of unity is sort of the first thing in all realms.
Now we can get back to your book on abstract market theory. I know that, Coop, you had some more interesting things in our notes.
I might rely on you to help me maybe perhaps formulate an actual question here. But as someone who is both fascinated by time and cinema, and I know that you spent an entire chapter from the book on temporality. So I was just kind of curious, perhaps discussing a little bit about what you drew from the cinema works, because I feel like Bergson too is going to be a major part of this temporality element as well. Perhaps first maybe go through sort of what you saw within the cinema books. I'm assuming that perhaps the time image would be the more relevant one based on inscription and the way that these sort of prices function in the market. But I'll let you, if that's a fair enough question.
It's a very fair question and a very good one. And I'm going to give you a very disappointing answer. Let me start by saying that I love the cinema books. I love them. They are insane. And they made the cinema new. It's a completely different experience now. I don't know what I thought it was before, but they really matter to me. And there is, by the way, a very interesting discussion of money earlier in cinema too as well. With this very strange analysis where Deleuze says, what does it mean when there is a screen within a screen? Like, what does it mean when there's a television playing something in a movie?
Interesting.
It's like, well, it's about money, which is like, what? What are you talking about? Anyway, it's a complicated argument, but interesting. Bracket that. So the elements from the cinema books that reinforced the understanding of time that I deployed were really from Cinema 1.
Okay.
And Bergson's notion of habituated temporality. This will become more clear in the second book, assuming that I finish it. Really, the thing that's important, I mean, here Bergson, in the way I think very much is like a Merleau-Ponty avant la lettre. Like the things that he's saying are basically that temporality is bodily habituated. And that, as a result, the way that we perceive the world is filtered through this kind of habituated temporality. And this is the idea of the perception image as subtraction, a subtracted image. The really insignificant thinker of time in abstract market theory is Freud. I'll just say it.
Right, Freud.
Freud's an account of time in the unconscious and the idea of screen memories. The idea of memory itself is something that is produced rather than about recollection per se.
Right.
So there is definitely an overlap and a connection with Bergson there. But that's the disappointing answer, that really there's no deep time, there's no virtual element in the analysis of the market. I don't think that we need to invoke that necessarily.
Perhaps this is why you mentioned earlier that in your next book, again, as you said, if you complete it, God willing, and all this, you mentioned that memory and money are going to be a focus. So is that going to be something that you elaborate further? It's kind of this question, because you're right about the way that Freud functions in I can't remember if it was chapter 3 or 4, the question of writing. And this also links up with Nietzsche too. He has a kind of interesting way of thinking about this, kind of like Freud, where if there weren't two different systems, right? If there wasn't the conscious, preconscious system, the sort of perceptual system, and then the traces left in the unconscious, if everything was sort of, jammed together on the perceptual field, we wouldn't have space for the new impressions, right? So there is something interesting about temporality with Freud.
Yeah. That's great, because I was just thinking about how you discussed the mystic writing pad. The unconscious absorbs all the information, and that's where the habituation comes in. And maybe we should even discuss habituation for the audience. I always give the example of, it's like when you move to a new city and your route home from work or whatever. At first you're taking in all the sensory experience. Everything's new, but eventually over time you begin to, it sort of like, I don't even know the word. It's kind of becomes a blur. You're not really
nature.
You're not really taking in all of the sensory. You're sort of only focusing on aspects of that, which makes total sense with reference to the cinema, because that same process, right? Because the camera is subtracting from the totality of reality, which I think that's just great.
That's 100% right. 100%. I agree completely. What you both said, Dan, is spot on, I think. And this is the terrain for me. The mystic writing pattern analysis. Freud's basic idea that there must be two systems for the reason that you've just indicated. Again, like Nietzsche's account of the two systems is motivated by an historical kind of approach. Like, how did we breed an animal that could make a promise?
Yes.
That's the great question of the essay 2 of the genealogy of morality. So there are two registers of memory. Arguably, we can say there's three, in the sense that there is what Freud calls a preconscious memory as well, like easily recollectable things. And so all the kind of temporal analysis, it's not really clear in abstract market theory, but in the next book, turns around treating these elements, except for that top level of memory, the preconscious memory, as social memories. That there have to be, as it were, two registers of social memory that undergird. So there's like a serial conditioning of the three layers of memory undergird conscious experience.
Yeah.
So my conscious experience of this can here is undergirded by preconscious memory, which is mine, if you like. And this is itself informed and modified by what Nietzsche calls it the memory of words, this kind of promising memory. And underneath that is the memory of traces, Now that's just the market for me. So the
Right.
market, anyway, gets very complicated very quickly, but those are the kind of, that's the idea, is to kind of pack in this analysis. The other figure here is Bernhard Stiegler, and Stiegler's idea of a epiphylogenetic memory, or a technological memory, which is, to me, what money is. I mean, money is the technology of memory, among other things, but it has this aspect. Again, to come back to the boring aspect of the answer, I don't think we need to invoke the memory in the Bergsonian sense here. And this is one reason why I think cinema, as Deleuze describes it, is so profoundly transformative, is because it interrupts this whole apparatus of memory, this complicated social productive mechanism, with something which is completely impassive, useless, to say not commodifiable,
Right.
interrupts habit and interrupts the structuring of memory and recollection that all social forms make use of, in particular capitalism.
This notion of social memory is interesting to me because the first thing that pops into my head, maybe this is weird, is and I only kind of know a little bit about this, but a kind of Mandela effect, right? That there is this interesting social misremembering, supposedly, and I'm not sure how factual or how experimentally verifiable or falsifiable this is, but supposedly there is this, and it's almost conspiracy theory bordering, right? Because it's this interesting, supposedly social phenomenon of sort of misremembering events or dates, or I'm not quite convinced by it, especially looking at some of the prime examples, obviously.
The Berenstein Bears.
Yeah, stuff like that. Like, I think it's almost more of a social media phenomenon that's like, that maybe is.
Yeah,
is
it's kind of like an
tongue-in-cheek.
urban legend sort of aspect to it. I will say that I remember Berenstein Bears with spelled EIN. So for whatever that's worth.
Sure. I don't think we need to necessarily construe any of this in negative terms again.
Interesting. Yeah.
A little bit touch back on Hume. Like what we remember is always affected by social processes. I mean, this is something that I think Stiegler is so good on, like my memories of how to walk home, to come back to this idea of, your familiarity with the city, are themselves underpinned by, like they're embedded in a kind of biological memory as well. Like memory, like my body itself, the genetic memory that supports the deployment of habituated kind of bodily agency and so on. But these two are also themselves affected by mediatized memory. So things like how we walk, where we walk, what we pay attention to, these things are all mediatized now, and they filter down and affect the other layers, like primary retention, conscious memory, and also eventually epigenetic memory. Like my body itself changes depending on where I walk and what I eat and so on.
Right.
So this is kind of like retroactive affecting of the structure of what I remember. But it's all social and, as it were, kind of a productive and dynamic in character, as well as being embedded in capitalist accumulation. This is the idea of the individual that Deleuze comes up with in capitalism, that we are kind of cut up into these various flows of information.
Yeah, the larval subject and
price would be a flow, right, of information ultimately.
Yeah, that price information connection is like a very important connection in the history of economics, and the idea of the efficient market hypothesis, that very famous idea that a market that conveys all information is an efficient market.
Seems like a fantasy.
It is a fantasy, yeah. But yes, the connection between price and information is an extremely kind of interesting one. Once we take the idea of information in a more serious way than this kind of godlike rays of truth or whatever.
Right.
The market hypothesis involves. So we could have recourse here to Simondon, and maybe, but also the other kind of philosophers of information like Ruwer, and I guess that whole tradition.
I'm curious about, obviously, two related questions. One, your interest. I mean, part of my interest in his work is from Deleuze, who I think that he's, as you mentioned, he's one of the few kind of interlocutors that keeps his work alive. But also, I mean, so the translation, right, of Genesis of Living Forms, but also his appearance in abstract market theory, I was a little surprised by. I'm just kind of curious about how you mobilize him. I kind of sketched out some topics, obviously, his relation to Deleuze, relation to your work, your interest in translating the Genesis of Living Forms, which was the very first thing I tried to translate when I still worked on the blog, and I just put up translations. I used it kind of as a as a little experimental ground. I had a background in Spanish and Latin. I translated the preface to, it's probably still up, to The Genesis of Living Forms.
Oh my goodness.
There's like 2 essays, maybe reviews of his work from like 1950. And then there's 2 there's 2 translations by Walker, R. Scott Walker, I believe, from like the 80s, right? And for the most part, until recently with your translation and Ed Leby's translation of neo-finalism, there really wasn't a lot besides, at least in English, right? Besides Deleuze's references to his work in Difference and Repetition. And I believe he shows up at least once or twice. He has to in 1,000 Plateaus about, embryogenesis. I'm not sure about that, though. I'd have to check.
If he's not there in name, he's certainly there.
In spirit, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, literally everything in the world is in that book. So,
that's true.
It's a fair guess. Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting questions here. I mean, I suppose, first of all, our kind of historical situation, you're right that for a long time nobody really paid attention to him. And it's partly a factor of his institutional decisions. That basically, he was born up near the border of Germany, and as soon as he could, he moved back there to live with his family.
Interesting,
he had no interest in being a part of the Parisian scene. So Merleau-Ponty writes about him a bit towards the end in The Visible and the Invisible, and in
I didn't know that.
His Nature lecture series. They're sort of having a bit of a beef with him, a very productive one, and just one of 100 things that we missed out on with Merleau-Ponty dying when he did.
Right. Lacan mentions him in Seminar 1 or 2. That's
right. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, pretty sparse. Now, interestingly, in France, the neo-finalism was put on the agrégation.
Interesting.
For philosophy, for 3 years or something, maybe 5 years ago. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit kicking around in France at the moment. There have been some journal issues that have come out, mainly kind of helmed by Anne Sauvignard, and she's been kind of the one waving the flag anyway.
And she's written on Simondon as well, and it makes sense. Like if Simondon's kind of having a resurgence, if you want to call it that. I mean, not least of which by Stiegler and his kind of rise to prominence, but also the publication of the full dissertation along with the complements and supplements. And then my little translation, that helps, at least on this side of the pond. I always mention this. I'll mention it again really quickly, just to give you a second to kind of speak more. I've always wanted to translate his little book on the Odyssey. I find it fascinating. He takes this little hypothesis from Samuel Butler that it was written by this young woman. It was written, first of all, that itself is a kind of revelation, but it was written by a young woman who's supposedly like a princess. Perhaps the character of Nausicaa is a reflection of her into the text. There are a lot of things, at least, that make sense of the Odyssey being written, just the different shifts in temporality, the different narrators. It has a totally different structure than the Iliad. That part, at least I find compelling, but the part that it's written by a young woman, I think is kind of this really fascinating hypothesis that Ruwer runs with. And it shows the breadth of his work. It really shows how, kind of like Deleuze, he's writing across all sorts of topics, not just science and not just biology, which is obviously some of the things he's most known for, and consciousness, and even embryology and embryogenesis, but even on these kind of wild and wacky theories about ancient literature. It kind of shows his breadth, and I always like to tell the story about. I almost think of it as the hoax where he's about this book on Gnosticism, where he claims to be talking to this cohort of scientists at Stanford, and that was one of the things that actually got him a little bit of interest, right?
Yeah, it's a hoax. It was a deliberate hoax, if I can put it that way on his part. He writes his own philosophy as if it was a bunch of a secretive society that had come up with this stuff. The Princeton Gnostics, it made him quite well known, and people cite that book now still as if it was a document of evidence. Luckily, thanks to Ruwer, he got to meet these people that had this weird philosophy.
Yeah,
so, it's literally his position, which is pretty strange. I do know that at least one other book is coming out in English. This book on cybernetics.
Yes.
The origin of information, and I think also. I have heard rumors of his final posthumous book, The Embryogenesis of the World, might be appearing in English. Ruwer is this kind of bizarre, it's got this quite bizarre idea that everything is a living being, and that to live is to be conscious, and that life extends beyond the barriers that we've placed up. Atoms, alive and conscious, and that fundamentally that the experience that every living being has of the world is auto-affective, that there isn't really a perception of the outside world, sort of Leibnizian, It sounds extremely strange, right? But it's based in his very thorough understanding of 20th century science, quantum mechanics, and developments in embryology and so on. So there's this kind of weird clash between all this scientific evidence, animal behavior studies, and this very strange sort of 17th century seeming philosophy of the monad, almost. Quite remarkable. But Deleuze picks it up because he's, I think, fundamentally interested in the way that Ruwer accounts for, let's say, the structure of perception. These kind of individuated processes within the being. Again, sort of drawing from Leibniz as well. So very strange figure. Why translate him? I don't know. I was just enchanted.
Same.
Somebody was saying this stuff.
Yeah.
So aside from wanting to understand what Deleuze had to say about him and why it was significant. I think probably my use of him in abstract market theory was unnecessary. I was trying to develop an idea of the market as a surface, intensive surface. And Ruwer seemed to me to be a way of going about that. But now, retrospectively, I kind of feel like I could have left that Ruwer stuff out.
But it's fun. It's fun. It makes sense. And I was also thinking about the fact that he even has a book, at least one. I'm trying to remember all the titles he has in his bibliography. It's pretty long. He has at least one book on value, and he's got at least an essay or two on axiology, right? Which I think makes him pretty important. As you said, not necessary, but again, fun and very enlightening of what you're working through.
So. Yeah, I think that's right for me. And I think also for Deleuze too. There's an essay, one of the essays on axiology is cited by Deleuze in Difference and Repetition. And you're right, there's a book called Theory of Values as well, sort of a bit later on.
And just to jump into different repetition for a second, we can stick a toe in this notion about depth and its primacy without necessarily putting you on the spot. I'm trying to relate this to a point that I think maybe I had conflated and confused even as recently as a couple of weeks ago when Cooper and I were talking. One of a constant that I've enjoyed, and it's helped me out, and you mentioned it even earlier, kind of in passing, is a conflation between the intensive and the virtual that sometimes happens. You even go into this in your great essay on the quasi-cause, which is another thing that Cooper and I have talked about, this kind of transformation of the quasi-cause from logic of sense into anti-Oedipus. I'm not going to make you reiterate all of this. I do think the thing that I was trying to get to was this point about distinguishing the intensive and the virtual and not being too quick to conflate them, because in my head, perhaps they were definitely associated, which makes sense, but perhaps I had conflated them as well. And I kind of want you to, if not elaborate that, at least point to your sensitivity towards this, because it seems like you are sensitive to this issue, that sometimes where this sensitivity came from, that the intensive and the virtual can get confused sometimes, or conflated or equated.
Yeah, it's a very vexed issue. I guess the first thing I'll say is that the reason why it's so easy to conflate them, I think, has to do with the English reception of Deleuze's work.
Interesting.
I.e. that Difference and Repetition was only released in English in 1995, right?
Yeah, 495, yeah.
So we get, first of all, Anti-Oedipus in in English, and then Nietzsche and Philosophy and the Kant book. The Kant book is quickly discarded, and then 1,000 Plateaus. And so if you read Anti-Oedipus, Nietzsche and Philosophy, and 1,000 Plateaus, it's very easy to, as it were, focus the attention on the intensive or as affective.
Yes.
And
Okay.
note that the affective is kind of primary, especially in 1,000 Plateaus, with respect to structure. And if you go back to Difference and Repetition and you start talking about the virtual as that which is prior to extended and qualified reality,
right,
it's easy to think that there are two terms in the discussion, the actual and the virtual. And so why did I start wondering about this? Well, it really just came from my puzzlement, what? I don't know what to explain. It wasn't because of anything that I can remember. I just
that's fine.
Banged my head against Difference and Repetition for a long, long time.
Yes, of course.
And to notice there are seams where this kind of seems like he's switching from one register to another.
Right.
That said, if you read the chapter 4 on Difference and Repetition, Deleuze is very clear. The virtual is the being of structure, he says, the being of structure.
Right.
When he talks about intensity, embryos, the intensive individual, these are dynamisms.
Right.
So how you can't square these two things, I don't think,
yes,
easily, and nor should you. But basically, The virtual gives the intensive a structure of a kind. It's a differential structure,
Right.
not something fixed and transcendent. But we must analyze them separately. So we have mathematics to think about the virtual. We have biology and thermodynamics to think about intensity. So I guess after a while, it just seemed to me to be more and more clear that this was what was going on.
Right.
And that all talk of virtual intensity, which is the phrase that often appears, is really, it's not describing anything in the book.
Right.
Now, final comment. The term virtual doesn't mean just one thing in Deleuze.
Mm-hmm.
The very final essay, Imminence, a Life, talks about the virtual as well. A life as virtual. This seems to me to be very far from what he means in difference and repetition.
Interesting.
So this is the other reason why I think difference and repetition is read wrongly. It's because elsewhere the term virtual has a much more expansive meaning.
Gotcha.
That seems very much disconnected from the sort of structuralist idea of the differential structure.
That's actually very helpful. And it's something that Cooper and I have also discussed when comparing and contrasting as best as we can the difference and similarities between how someone like Baudrillard talks about the virtual, for example, right, versus how Deleuze does. And the fact that, as you say, thinking about it that way, that the virtual shifts at least expands or changes in Deleuze's own work is very illuminating on that point, and would be a better place perhaps to start.
I think so, yeah. It's an extremely boring point to make, but yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm
not my point, not your point, mine.
No.
Obsessing about this thing,
No. I see, but I honed in on it too, and I don't think it's maybe as boring as you think it is, but I do think it does. And I was thinking about this too. We can move on after this. I wasn't sure whether or not he gets differentiation with a T and a C. You laid that out. Differentiation with the T is obviously related to the virtual, the mathematical. Differentiation with the C is related to sort of actualization and to the biological. I was wondering if he gets part of this language from Ruwer, or if this was more of something that he develops on his own, because it does remind one of Derrida and difference, where it's something that can't be parsed out through hearing. It's always something that can be parsed out seeing, since it's this homophone, right? That sounds the same, but that can only be distinguished through this writing.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. It's the most clumsy term that Deleuze ever comes up with. In the drama differentiation, nightmarish term. But yeah, the answer is I don't know, honestly. I don't know where he gets it from. Ruwer himself has... Mathematics is the one science of the 20th century, if I can put it like that he really has no sense of.
Right.
Except for very broad gesturing towards set theory,
Yeah. Gotcha.
But Deleuze is very clearly drawing these terms from modern analysis and mathematics. And
gotcha. Yeah.
The calculus and so on. So my guess would just be that these are terms that he develops in relation to mathematics. But
I guess that would be a way to just move on to this next point. And again, this might be in your conversations with Graham Jones. I'm trying to remember, but you put it very well, I think, in distinguishing the deconstructive method, which is looking for these symptomatic gaps and sort of trying to find the inconsistencies in systems, versus Deleuze, who, even if a thinker may seem fragmentary, or even with someone like Nietzsche, who has some things to say about being wary or suspicious of systematic thinkers, where I believe the words I put in quotes here are from Graham. I'm not sure the nascent systematicity, even in a fragmentary thinker. Do you want to speak maybe a little bit about that? Because I really thought it helped to crystallize their different methodologies, at least.
I mean, that question, it's thought-provoking to me. First of all, yes, that line is from Graham's PhD thesis. I find it is the single most helpful thing for me in reading a book of Deleuze's.
Interesting.
The thing is always, what is the system? What's the horizon of systematicity at work in this?
Yes.
On Proust or cinema or whatever. It's always about constructing a system or drawing a system out of the very famous buggery idea. I did the history of philosophy, but it's a pretty dumb analogy, I think, because there's a sense in which he kind of even of Kant, for instance, that he systematizes Kant in a way that is goes beyond what Kant himself would be willing to do.
Right.
But gives us a strong portrait of Kant. It involves bending some pieces, shifting, as it were, the significance of some bits relative to others. This is the direction anyway that Deleuze goes.
Yeah.
Okay, vis-a-vis Derrida. I think we have to distinguish here between what Derrida is talking about as a system, or he talks about it as a structure as well.
Right.
Famous structure, son and player. So he's talking about Western metaphysics and
Yes.
various instantiations of Western metaphysics. So it is, as it were, that the structure is already there. In Deleuze, on the other hand, we have an idea of the production of a system.
Interesting.
This idea of heterogenesis.
Yes.
You read Nietzsche. Nietzsche's not systematic. Just, I think it's probably fair to say, at least to some significant degree.
Right.
But Deleuze produces a system,
Mm-hmm.
or drives in that direction in reading Nietzsche. And so this is connected to this notion of the system in heterogenesis that you brought up as well. Derrida does not think it's possible, as it were, to have. I mean, I'm just repeating things that everybody knows about Derrida, right? There is no radical creation for Derrida.
Right.
Creation is impossible. Invention is impossible. Nevertheless, ... Kind of deconstructive gesture. But for Deleuze, he's just completely uninterested in these questions of Western physics, of the association of system and violence. He thinks both that this is wrong and that he doesn't really care about it. He said it himself, the most innocent of his generation. No concern for these questions. And that's something that I think merits like serious attention. We should take the Derrida-Deleuze distinction very seriously. Presents us with two conceptions of thinking, of philosophy, of philosophical practice. It educates us thinking about this. But it should be obvious I've already decided which side of the fence to fall down.
Yeah.
In my view, Derrida is an educator, first of all. That when we read Derrida, we learn how to read. We learn how to pay attention in a rigorous way. But if you stop there, that's a mistake.
Interesting. I like that.
It's like and so we need to go beyond that to put it in my naive way, a kind of productive moment where we think anew, we create something.
Yeah. This was something we talked about with Vern Cisney, and he kind of falls on the side of Deleuze as well, although he makes a pretty strong argument for why Derrida's sort of tendency to privilege the negative and why that's important to the motor of deconstruction. He makes a pretty strong argument for why that too has its merits. And I do think, though, it's interesting that one of the things that I really enjoyed in also elaborating their difference, and we can again move on from this, is Derrida's caution or maybe dismissal of philosophy as concept creation, which Deleuze kind of at least elaborates most declaratively in what is philosophy.
Perhaps you're referring to Derrida's obituary for Deleuze.
Yes.
Where he says, he starts by saying, I don't have any objections to Deleuze, not even virtual ones, which is very. And then he goes to list two at the end.
Yeah, right.
Why does he use our toes, body, or organs the way that he does? And why did he identify philosophy as creation of concepts? And it's for the reason that he does disagree with both of these readings. Derrida's own texts on Artaud are amazing texts on Artaud, including this incredible book on Artaud's drawing, which I cannot recommend highly enough. And of course, he doesn't think that concept creation is possible for like a whole ramified series of reasons.
Right.
Not only that, the level of the concept is already caught up in a kind of metaphysical system of Western history. And also the creation itself or invention has this kind of possible, impossible.
I was trying to find a quote, and I don't know if it exists, so I may have made it up. Here's the Mandela effect thing going on. Or maybe it's just my individual predilection. I could have sworn Deleuze says somewhere that what he was practicing was metaphysics, or that he considered himself a pure metaphysician.
Yeah, he says this a couple of different times. That's right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Metaphysics, pure metaphysics, just philosophy in a traditional sense. He says these kinds of things a lot. You might be thinking of the letter to
a harsh critic,
Jean-Claude Martin. No.
Oh, okay. The letter. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, he says it in there as well. That's right. I mean, I agree. There's no reason to denounce this. This sort of touches on some of the other questions that you two have posed as well, which is concerning like postmodern, post-structural.
Yeah.
These labels. I'm completely indifferent to all of these. These are marketing labels in my view.
Right.
And they function just like marketing labels in the university. They're not philosophical. You know that line, like, there's only two kinds of music, good music and bad music? It's the same in philosophy. There's good philosophy and there's bad philosophy. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the whole story. We are contemporaries of Plato.
Right.
The end. to get into that other kind of like, well, he's a little bit of a postmodernist, isn't he? This idiot kind of debate. This Jordan Peterson style mudslinging.
Oh, yeah.
Like beneath the level of idiocy in my view.
Postmodern neo-Marxism or whatever it is that I suppose what I meant, I was hesitant writing it that way, was a shorthand for some of the contemporaries, even some that you mentioned, or we've mentioned, Derrida, Lyotard, Baudrillard. I'm not trying to speak for them, and I could be just misreading or misthinking this, but there does seem to be a hostility to metaphysics, and this may be a post-Kantian thing. Maybe that would be a better way to phrase it. A sort of post-Kantian hesitancy to, and I was also thinking about Meillassoux and his way of kind of framing this as, if we're going to sort of move past some of these impasses with regard to correlationism, there needs to be a kind of non-metaphysical solution. Maybe that's also what I kind of had in mind. And so thinking about how Deleuze doesn't shy away from this, and even isn't bothered by whether it be the closure of metaphysics or the death of philosophy and all these things. He's not really bothered with this. This kind of maybe reiterates some of the points you've already made, but I suppose that's part of what I was thinking of.
Let me clarify that. I didn't at all mean to criticize your question itself.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
As you said, it's a really good question. And
that's fine.
I think, first of all, everything you said is really revealing. I think post-Kantian is a decisive determination here. And of course, I'm thinking of a Lyotard title, a note on the meaning of post here. But of course, post-Kantian means more than one thing. And it can mean we're done with Kant. And
True.
Not that many people would boldly say that, except for maybe Meillassoux now. But also that we are, as it were, in the wake of Kant.
Mm-hmm.
Deleuze and Lyotard, and certainly Foucault and Derrida are post-Kantians in this sense. But it's true that Deleuze is the only one who really wants to embrace the label of metaphysics in a classical sense.
Yeah. Maybe that's part of the naivete or the innocence.
It is.
That's
right.
Speaking of Letter to a Harsh Critic, I was trying to think about how he formulates it, where he says he hopes he never wrote something that would hurt someone's feelings. Even, and I suppose that even includes Kant and Hegel, whom he kind of considers as enemies. I forget exactly how he says it, but he kind of says basically he hopes he doesn't write something that would make another thinker cringe. But at the same,
I think he says sadden.
Sadden. Like, to get back to this question
I think that's it. Yeah.
To get back to this question of saddening, I mean, I suppose if philosophy, one aspect of it is, and he has a lot of different definitions of it. Concept creation is just one of them, right? Throughout the works, even with empiricism, subjectivity, it's the theory of what we do, and it even has one where it's about a portraiture. So a lot of times we remember it's about buggering and giving birth to this monstrosity that would yet be the philosopher's own, it couldn't be disowned by them, a sort of bastardization that would be faithful. But there is also this sense of a portraiture. And I think it's like, he doesn't want to make a portrait that would be, I don't know if unrecognizable is the right word, but as you said, doesn't want to be saddening. And that does seem to go back to his innocence and his, even when he's disagreeing with Hegel, he has, for example, in Nietzschean philosophy, right? He has a targets in mind, and he has problems that he's trying to highlight rather than being polemical, like something that at least Badiou in his early years would do, right? Or being dismissive. He is engaging with someone like Hegel very seriously, and the kind of the spirit of Hegel is haunting him. But again, that wasn't really a question. That was just kind of riffing there.
No, sure. I mean, that's all true, I think. The whole Hegel thing, I suppose. I mean, he says elsewhere, every story needs a villain, which I quite like. Calling Hegel a villain is to give him a positive position in the
That's
system.
true.
He's not anti-Hegel, which, of course, as everyone knows, would be the dumbest possible position to occupy vis-a-vis Hegel. Hegel has a positive, provocative position. And I still think, setting aside what happens in Nietzsche and philosophy, which is very clearly motivated by a response to the phenomenology of spirit, I think that Michael Hart's very early book on Deleuze, there's a chapter on Nietzsche in there, and he says that Deleuze's main concern with Hegel is not the phenomenology, but the science of logic. And I think that is very, very true. And
interesting.
The problems that he has with Hegel concern much more profound kind of structural questions of metaphysical questions than simply the slave morality issue.
Right.
And this partly comes up in chapter 4 of Difference and Repetition around the calculus as well.
Right.
Very clearly gives a non-Hegelian rendering of the status of the differential in that chapter. Again, these are all like super inside baseball type things, but yeah.
This is part of the thing. Like Cooper has recently kind of introduced me into someone like Stirner and more deeply into the world of Dune. These are his favorite things. And some of my favorite things are Deleuze, and sometimes it is a little inside baseball, but I think that this is partly why I thought to engage you is,
Sure.
We're gonna go more deeply. But I will take a moment. I know Cooper, I know you added a couple more questions. I don't want to hog the spot. We could go back and talk a little bit more about AMT, as I call it, abstract market theory.
That's what I call it. Yeah, I picked the title very specifically to flip the bird to actor network theory, which is
I
AMT
didn't
comes before it in the alphabet. Yeah,
there you go. I didn't think about that, and that's
you got to slightly those kinds of digs best to keep implied rather than
I like it
explicit.
That. Speaking of inside baseball, that's an inside joke, right? Keep the polemics subtext a little. I like it.
Don't undersell my own interest in Deleuze as well.
No. I wasn't. I was merely trying to say this is part of the process. It's getting
give and take, right?
Getting some, and it's I do think that perhaps I think our audience is kind of the perfect audience for this. So don't be bashful.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be bashful.
Right.
Yeah.
I honestly think it's a relic of. Here in Australia, in Melbourne, where I live, we during the last couple of years we were locked down super hard for a really long time, and I, for the most part, was in this apartment by myself, and it's completely screwed my sense of social etiquette.
Oh no.
Who wants to talk about Deleuze? Nobody wants to talk about philosophy. That's crazy. That's lost that kind of social going to the pub, fighting with people about Kant or whatever.
This is exactly what this forum is for, and
it's about the vibes. Podcast. Yes,
that's right.
We'll go back to abstract market theory because so the whole reason I was sort of going into the temporality element was I thought it was kind of interesting how you sort of describe the way that prices, like the temporality of pricing, because it's sort of like these predictive models are always they're sort of fooling themselves into saying they're predicting a future, but what they're really doing is sort of drawing from the past. And I don't know if you could perhaps go into a little bit about temporality and its relation to pricing in the market, because I think this is a super interesting thing. And I don't know if I guess the derivatives would be a whole other line of questioning.
Sure. The analysis that I give is really just an extrapolation from Bergson's argument in The Possible and the Real. Whenever we say it's possible that I could have not come on this podcast or whatever,
yes,
what I'm doing is retrojecting the current state of the world intellectually into the past and stripping it of retrojecting it into the past, and I'm adding this kind of extra element to it that it was possible, this extra kind of feature. The thing that's important to me about this analysis, other than the fact that it has astonishing reach, I think, in contemporary thought, it's yet to be kind of plumbed, I think. The use of possible and probable everywhere. So it's not just economics, but it's also, utopian political thinking.
Yes.
The degree to which this invokes a possible future is already caught up in this. The only future that we can imagine to be possible is one that is like ours already. So it gives up in the first moment, a priori, if you like, the kind of utopian reach of the thought itself. Now, just parenthetically, I think this is also a problem with the faculty of the imagination, which is way too much power, in my view, in contemporary political thinking. And let's just bracket that. Let's not talk about the imagination. These kind of predictive models, and this is the point that Ayash makes, most famous one, the Black-Scholes model for derivative pricing, work in the way that Bergson talks about. They take a current situation and they retroject it and add this kind of extra feature to it, which is to say that it's a form of intellectual validation of the present. But when somebody prices something, it is because there's no reason to price anything at any price at all. It's completely contingent or arbitrary. That act of pricing can't be, as it were, fit within this probable projected outcome kind of analysis that we get with Black-Scholes. So there is a contingency that necessarily is associated with price that interrupts the habitual repetition of the present. This is the second half of the thing, which we talked about before. The real significance of Bergson's analysis is not that thinking in terms of the possible is a mistake that idiots make. It's that it is implicit in our mode of existence as such.
Right.
We cannot but think in terms of possibility. It's built into the kind of habitual framework of our experience of the world. So the final step, the third step, if you like, in the sequence for me is simply to say that this habit of thinking in terms of possibility is not an individual habit, as Bergson tends to present it to, but is actual a social habit.
Right.
That contemporary society always, as it were, gives us the possible worlds that we deserve.
I love that.
It allows us to discriminate between and prioritizes some possible worlds rather than others as a way of thinking about the present. And then, fourth point, the last thing to add would be that I think we already get this in Foucault's analysis of power. And that's what I say in the last chapter. When Foucault talks about the operation of power, he says what it does is, it's not negative or oppressive. It produces things. What it does, he says, is valorize possible states. So if I think about my future actions, some possible courses of action get valorized more than others. That's how power works, is to kind of distribute possibility. So we see now that it's not really a social habit per se, that it is indeed the very kind of activity of political power in society is to organize our understanding of possibility, a possibility which is itself only a form of reflection on the present and not on the future. Right.
This is really helpful to contextualize the move that Meillassoux makes at the end of After Finitude, which is, that probability, when applied to the universe as a whole, is kind of invalidated, right? This is the difference between chance and contingency, as he points out. It can't be totalized. And the formulation you just made, which I think is great, about we have the possible worlds we deserve, is a very kind of Deleuzean, Guattarian way of formulating it, right? Because what is it? He says in Nietzschean philosophy, and I actually tweeted this out earlier, so I'm going to look at it and just make sure I get this right. We always have the truths we deserve as a function of the sense of what we conceive, of the value of what we believe. And Guattari says in the opening pages of Machinic Unconscious that we have the unconscious we deserve. I think it differs repetition. Deleuze talks about we have that problems merit their solutions depending on how they're sort of formulated, which is why it's so important to have, speaking of power, to have that's the real power, right? Is being able to formulate problems. Again, these are just reflections.
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. To kind of summarize what the broader point, the temporality issue is central here, I think. One of the features of sort of neoclassical economics in a way is its atemporality, that there's only ever barter relations. They can be completely formalized without loss. They certainly don't tackle something like even something which is a relatively basic mathematical point that Meillassoux makes, as you just indicated, Taylor, the non-totalizability of the infinite. There's no set of all sets. It's impossible to overstate how much of a scam neoclassical economics is, and given the scope of its influence, which is just insane. So anyway, one of the elements of introducing the temporal aspect of the analysis is to interrupt this kind of atemporal heaven of barter relation that we get in neoclassical economics. Related to that is a question about the status of history as well, because I think that there is a certain Marxism. Here I'm bouncing off of some remarks made by Pierre Classe, the anthropologist. Some Marxists tend to think that there have only ever been two forms of society, capitalism and pre-capitalism. And this is a way of denigrating and basically dismissing everything before, not allowing a discrimination into different forms of pre-capitalist society. So I think one of the key things moving forward for this second book in economics for me is insisting on the difference between pre-state and state societies as social formations. And it's only by doing this that we find the means to properly understand money, I think, properly understand the nature of social memory, because we don't kind of bundle it all up into some sort of generalization.
This is something that Cooper and I have really enjoyed speaking about, and not only in Society Against the State, but even in the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, where there is this paradox of, given the non-evolutionism that they subscribe to, and that Cluster at least partially subscribes, they have a little beef with him later in The Thousand Plateaus. But for the most part, he subscribes to that it's not as though all pre-capitalist societies are going to evolve or just haven't evolved into them. But even this paradox of the Urstaat, which seems to always loom its head beneath every empire. There's another empire. Its empire is all the way down. Anyway, Coop, it looks like you...
if you want to finish your point, please.
No. I was just kind of saying how you and I have had some good discussions on Cluster's work.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely enjoy the anthropology stuff quite a bit. To go back to the talk on derivatives, I thought it was interesting how you brought up both, I guess, this way in which, I guess it's like this sort of critique of Kant in a sense where the underlying assets that make up these derivatives, there's a disentanglement, like there's no real connection to the underlying assets. And I thought back immediately, I don't know if either of you have seen the film, like The Big Short, where they go to the bond rating agency, I forget which, it was Moody's or something like that. And they're like, look, all of these fucking mortgages are these underlying bonds that are supposed to be, that are bundled up in these CDOs or other forms of derivative, etc., are like falling. Why the hell haven't these prices dropped? So I don't know. I thought that was like an interesting kind of application of sort of your argumentation to some degree, but I don't know, you may disagree, but I'm kind of interested in that discussion of how, I guess there's much like language, I guess, signifier signification, like there's only this sort of system relative to, everything sort of hangs in the balance imminently.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's true. There is a good analogy there with, the Lacanian idea of signifier. That's right. I mean, because fundamentally, and this can simply be described by saying that pricing is contingent as well. Like,
the big line that you said that all pricing is derivative, not just these derivatives. That was the big point, I think. That's
right. Yeah. In other words, that there is no. It has two senses. First, that price is not native. That social production is a production of value or evaluation. Price is something in addition to that. But also that everything is priced on the same surface. There's not like two markets. Traders tend to talk about, there's the market in the underlying oil or whatever, Microsoft stocks, and then the market in derivatives. But they're all priced at the same level.
Right.
There isn't an ontological separation between these two sets of prices, if you like, as they're inscribed in the market. That's the crucial thing, I think. Now, the problem, like Black-Scholes, right, basically it looks like a tool for predicting the future, to put it very crudely. But really the way that it's used by traders, and this is what Ayash is sort of getting at as well, it's used as a kind of tool, and really it's a tool that links together price and volatility. And most responsible traders trade on volatility and not on price. They'll buy something at a certain volatility level, which is to say, in other words, that even at that point where it seems like the metaphysics of possibility and probability are most concentrated in financial activity, it's actually not central whatsoever. There is this kind of ongoing contingent relationship to volatility, or kind of radical contingency, if you like. Now, the reason why the derivatives are significant in that book is simply comes down in the end to the aperture that Ayash's work gave me. So I just sort of started with him because he's interested in derivatives. But as you get very quickly to the point where you're just talking about price. Once you banish the difference between underlying and derivative at the level of the being of price, if I can put it like that, then you're just talking about prices.
And I think this gets back to why Ruwer is actually helpful here, because you're describing absolute service, self-survey, right?
That's exactly why I took him up. It seems, you've just kind of like, the two of you just reconstructed my argument basically for the first couple of chapters of the book. You can see why you would go to Ruwer. You're like, it's an idea of a surface that doesn't have things on it exactly. The surface itself modulates.
Yes.
And these modulations are prices. The texture of the market itself is itself the kind of means by which the prices are recorded on the market, in the market, as it were. Yeah.
How would this relate to intensity? Because I was thinking about price as a sine wave sort of thing, where there's like, that just makes logical sense in the sense of like, you can see a price spikes or it troughs, and there's kind of this ongoing sort of wave process rather than these specific points where price, I guess, you would say crystallizes or whatever the case, but it's constantly in motion, which is kind of interesting.
It's a kind of a phase space, the market, if you look at the surface of the market. So it's not two-dimensional, but three-dimensional, or in terms of visualizing it. So whenever one price goes up, it affects the prices that are proximate to it. And here's where Ruwer is useful as well, because he also talks about, there's no radical elsewhere on the surface. Every price is related to every other through a kind of series of ramifications, if you like.
Or like, and again, this goes to the signification. That was why I was thinking, the signifier signification, because it's kind of like everything sort of holds in the balance, and one move here is going to shift something else.
Exactly. Yeah. The thing that is missing, of course, is the quilting point in the Lacanian analysis. And it's interesting, our mutual friend James Cullum, that's his kind of one of the things that he's trying to think about is how you might introduce the point de capiton, the function of the master signifier into the kind of process of pricing.
Right. It calls into question, or at least it begs the question of, that's not the word, this discussion of the modulation of the absolute surface. It's this question of where are the, as you said, the master signifiers, where's the transcendental phallus or whatever that upon which everything hangs. And
for me, there isn't one.
Right.
For James, he thinks that there might be, or there might be some function that engages in this.
Interesting.
Any kind of stability arises at the level of value and the social production and reproduction of evaluation. Basically.
Right. Which would get us into it would get us into, obviously, back into the question of social valuation, as Ruwer mentions, as Hume mentions, as Marx mentioned. It gets us into these broader things that perhaps are, I don't want to say external to the market, but related in a complex way, which is why the third conflation you deal with is differentiating or distinguishing the market and the social. It gets back to that.
Right.
This is kind of a jokey comment, but I was just thinking about especially with the way that inflation has become such a recent topic of discussion, these kind of really funny, like, I don't know if you would, they're not anachronisms, but it's almost like that. Something like Arizona iced tea is 99 cents, or like the hot dog at Costco is $2 or some shit like that.
Well, the dollar store is now the $1.25 store, right? I mean, it's...
But the hot dog remains the same price. Yeah, it's quilted into the social fabric.
There you go. I mean, it's. I have heard. I don't remember where I saw something. Maybe it was some clickbait about some dollar store fanatic is talking about everything's $1.25 or whatever. You better bring some quarters. I don't know. That's something I was thinking about. So maybe if we are to stick with James for another second about the quilting point you're talking about, perhaps those are relative stabilities that can stabilize for more indefinite amount of time, but still have leeway in movement.
That's right. I think that's it. The relationship between, this comes back to the point about intensity. I think, the market is an intensive surface in the sense that it is realized or played out in terms of extensity, in terms of like social materiality and the values that come to qualify that materiality.
Right.
So the movement is from intensity to extension, to qualified extension, basically, or evaluated social practice and material reality. So they're not separate per se. There is a kind of, I would want to say simply that there is a kind of, it's a transcendental relationship between the market and the social. It's not, the market is not some elsewhere. It's implicit in social practice. We can always analyze it on its own terms, but we have to remember that it's not heaven. It's always being realized through social practices at every point. So it's just this kind of like ongoing variation in social reality that is affected by prices, problematizing particular social instances and processes. So you could imagine two undulating surfaces related to one another, where the lower level, the market level, figures as distortions in the organization of motion on the second surface. That's precisely how a price functions. When you go into a shop and you see a price, you're forced to ask the question of value in relation to it. So it problematizes the evaluative relationship to reality that is characteristic of society, I think.
This is maybe related somewhat to this question of the quilting points, the stability points, and the modulation of the surface. But this interesting notion, if I'm going to say this correctly, so black swans, as Taleb works it out, are these wholly unpredictable events that can seemingly be retroactively explained or predicted. But if we go deeper into contingency, which is the way you dive into the book, we get to this point very quickly whereby insofar as probability is kind of been deflated to a certain extent, either we're left with all white swans where everything's predictable, including these catastrophes or crises, or everything are blank swans, which I'm not exactly sure how to articulate, but I wondered, you try to make this point somewhere in the sort of early middle part of the book. And I'm wondering about this question of which swans do we have and how can we formulate this? I'm sure you can formulate this a little bit better than I can, but.
No, sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And again, this is Ayash's, one of the things I take from Ayash, he says what's required is a transcendental deduction of the black swan.
Interesting.
Which is a fantastic formulation. And what he means is that, well, let's start with Taleb, right? Yeah. So Taleb defined the black swan as having these three characteristics. Effectively, they're kind of surprises, bad surprises. Now, he is basically a Humean. They're bad surprises in the sense that our habituated relationship with the world doesn't make room for them. And so when they happen, it's like a relationship breakup, where someone says, we need to talk, and
the sun,
blindsided.
The sun didn't rise, the billiard ball flew off the table, whatever.
That's right, yeah. What do you mean we need to talk? Ayash's point is that Taleb frames all of this in terms of probability and possibility. And that the real issue with prices is not that some prices are black swan, unexpected. The problem is that the whole mode of thinking about events and prices in particular, in terms of possibility, is wrong. And so we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we tend to think in terms of possibility about events, especially black swan events? And so basically, Ayash wants to replace the idea of unlikely with contingent. And that would mean that, all swans are equally black, if you like, or we should talk about the blank swan, which is the name of Ayash's book. So a transcendental deduction of the black swan is an explanation for the relationship between the contingency of events and our tendency to frame this contingency in terms of probabilistic analysis.
Right. I was going to jump in and say the question of Taleb being a Humean and linking this to Meillassoux and contingency, it seems like there is a frequentialism, as Meillassoux calls it, where is the goal for Taleb to try to minimize the frequency with which black swans appear and therefore to be able to predict everything in a certain sense?
No.
Okay, gotcha.
That's a good question. He's Humean in this regard as well. His next book, Taleb's next book after that, The Black Swan, was Anti-Fragile.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay, yes.
Yeah. So the solution is just like, we should be more humble.
Interesting. Right. Okay.
Should restrain our tendencies to make hard and fast claims about what's possible. It's not, as it were, a kind of move from absolutism to frequentialism or anything like that. It's a kind of a moral or an ethical stance he's asking us to adopt in relation to the world. But yeah, the problem with this for Ayash is just that it's still framed in terms of possibility and probability.
Right.
You just need to be sensitive to the fact that our probabilistic analysis are sometimes not capacious enough.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, you've done nothing. You've become more timid, but everything else is still there.
Right. In order to save the system, in order to save, whether it be the capitalist system or whatever you want to call it, and speculation in this perverse sense, it's to become more humble, but it's like becoming more humble to shackles or something like that, right? It's
right. Yeah. Just settle in. But I think it's also just to have relinquished a critical move, a real genuine critical move in the Kantian sense.
Gotcha.
That said, I mean, like if you propose to somebody that we should stop using probabilistic analysis in science, you sound like a crazy person.
Yes.
There is no science today that is not predicated on probabilistic analysis, including things like physics, like the study of quantum particles is about the likelihood of a particle being in a position. You can see why just being humble is a more straightforward solution for a lot of people than, let's dispense with probabilistic thinking.
No more Wolf of Wall Street, no more cocaine and during the trading hours, right? But it also seems like that's a kind of response to what Cooper brought up earlier with CDOs, and be a little bit more humble, and you won't have a crisis that devastates the economy or something like that, right?
Yeah. That is effectively the upshot of all of the kind of ethics panels and oversights and reviews, at least at the kind of mainstream orthodox level. I mean, CDOs there's a sense in which, I mean, again, our mutual friend James Cullen, who works for a bank here in Australia, he pointed out to me the other day, all the people who were working in finance knew exactly how CDOs worked, not the people who were like managerial level, but the people, as they used to say, in the pit, who are actually coding the algorithms, knew exactly. It's relatively simple mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
The problem came at a different level in the process. Anyway, this is by the by.
It's good.
But CDOs as well. I mean, that's the other thing. Ayash says these are not derivatives. This is another of his exclusionary gestures. But it seems wrong to me that they were priced. They were priced in the market, the end. That's the only kind of relevant thing from this point of view.
I thought it was interesting. I know you made this point in passing, but the different tranches of the credit default swaps or whatever, the more stable ones, the higher ones may have been quote unquote more valuable or had better prices, but it was the riskier ones or the ones that were more likely to default that could have been more lucrative. I thought that was interesting.
That's right.
Well, more
I mean,
risk.
that's-
I mean, you're assuming more risk of loss.
There it
Gotcha.
is,
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I mean, again, like as I said before, like the basic relationship that pricing tools like Black-Scholes work with is the price volatility relationship. So you buy things, the higher the volatility, you've got to pick your, let's say, taste for volatility.
Yeah. Right.
That often comes first rather than what prices is selling at. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, that's also why, Deleuze's thoughts about the differential and all of this is essential starting point to get into. All of this is great. And I learned a ton from the abstract market theory book, and I am looking forward to your follow-up, as you said, which, not to use probability, but hopefully we won't have to. I know I had a bunch of other questions on Hume and these other things. I'm trying to think a good way to start to wrap up. I know we've had you for almost 2 hours. No, yeah, well, for more than 2 hours. Time has flown. We've discussed a lot of things. I'm sure there's something else we can kind of wrap up if you guys are ready to.
You're the ones that are plunging into the darkness of night over there.
You've been very generous with your time, but I know we could talk about a ton of other things, and at a certain point there has to be the ananke, the infinite regress has to stop. I guess I'm trying to remember what.
If you want to take a moment to formulate, I would have a quick comment because
have your comment. I probably have a Deleuze question to ask. So
I used to trade Apple stock because at the time it was like $600 a share or something like that, and the volatility was something like a few dollars. It could swing within a week by a $5, let's say, share price. So I would basically keep doing that and then reinvesting, and based on that, just the standard deviate the volatility on a day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month basis and try to take profit that way from the market.
Yeah, there it is.
Which is a foolish thing to do. Don't ever try to. I definitely could have lost myself a little bit, but I guess Apple wasn't going to go anywhere, so I felt a little bit safer.
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess instead of going deeper into a subject, this could be a kind of a lighter note. I say that, but you may think this could be a broad. Let's be a broader note. That's not a lighter note. You said something that I hadn't thought of, but I should have, which was you mentioned this need or this desire, both, I suppose, for a critical edition of Deleuze's works, perhaps something like the Cambridge texts, and I was intrigued by this. I just wanted to maybe this could be something broad on Deleuze we can use as an outro. I'm curious about maybe this feeling that struck you, whether it be through writing on Deleuze, obviously at length, and you kind of perhaps arbitrarily chose, when I'm citing Deleuze, I'm going to cite just the first versions that come out, the first translations. Just give me your sense of this desire for a critical edition, and if it would come with retranslations. Some works need them more than others, perhaps. And we could talk just a little bit about this. Yeah. I mean, to get back to your thesis on Derrida, this question of translation too. I mean, there is those aspects. So I'm curious about this. This idea.
It's come up a couple of times in passing over the last 10 years. Semi-officially. The reason why it's going to be difficult to make happen is that the rights for the books are owned by one publisher. Rights for the English translation. So that's one thing. What to say? I suppose, first of all, let's just go back to, again, the order in which Deleuze's work were translated and published. This affected the way that subsequent books were translated, obviously, because there's sort of established Deleuze scholarship by, let's say, the early 90s, was heavily colored by readings of 1,000 Plateaus.
Gotcha. Yeah.
When you take this and try and translate the logic of sense, for instance, just to give you one example, right?
Yeah.
Anti-Oedipus, 1,000 Plateaus. Everybody knows that Deleuze and Guattari hate psychoanalysis, right? Quote unquote. And if you look at in the preface to Logic of Sense, you'll see that
the
translator has said, you know this line, right? This is my attempt to write a psychological novel, it says in English, but it's of course psychoanalytic novel. This is one example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. There's the affect of the scholarship on the work of the translator. No judgment, right? Translating.
No, of course.
Horrifyingly difficult. That's one thing. It would be going back into the works from now a kind of more stable point of view, and terminologically speaking, could correct those kinds of things. The two other kind of tendencies that people had, I mean, many of the translators early on weren't philosophers.
Like what?
Tomlinson.
Tomlinson it's like a lawyer?
I forget the exact story.
Or
but
at least that's his main occupation. But I've looked into him and I found out he's a barrister or something like that. I was like, what?
Something like that. Yeah. Anyway, so there are some issues around that, in particular the kind of use of Kantian terminology. And Deleuze very routinely uses the opposition between in principle and in fact, de facto and de jure, right? In Latin,
right.
Which is a Kantian and Bergsonian distinction, and that is translated. I mean, en fait in French can mean, it can be taken in a very kind of colloquial, straightforward sense, but it actually has a terminological weight.
Yes.
Stuff like this, right?
Yes.
Somehow gets kind of submerged a little bit. The other thing that happened is in the other direction, which was translators being too careful. Here, the key example, I think, is probably Patton's translation of difference and repetition. The title of the fourth chapter, right, is he translates it as ideas and the synthesis of difference.
And that's not, it's something about...
The literal is ideal, totally, ideas and the ideal synthesis of difference.
Yes.
And he's done this to avoid the impression that, Deleuze is talking about the ideal synthesis of difference and the best one.
Right. I see. I don't think that would be a reading anyone would have.
I agree. But, it's obvious that he's said this to me. He was motivated by a concern that people would misinterpret Deleuze. Those kinds of concerns, I think, need to be addressed. To put it in the simplest and very crude way of putting it, there needs to be a corrective republication of Deleuze's work with a sensitivity to philosophical terminology, in particular Kantian terminology. The further thing to say, unfortunately, is that a couple of the books are just unacceptably bad.
I've always heard about the fold being bad, and
that's the worst one.
I still have to ask why. Maybe you have an example or two, but I've also found the translation of the Foucault book to be a little undesirable.
That's the other.
Okay.
They're the examples, really. So the fold, there is, I guess some people know this already, but Dan Smith has done another translation of the fold.
He mentioned it on the podcast. Yes, and
it is exceptionally good.
He's got to put that a bootleg on it. He can use fair use or something but I don't think he's going to do that. He's not like me where I just bootleg things.
We got to get that copy from him whenever we do it.
Oh, you should. Yeah.
He did say he would circulate it privately. So
nice.
It's really good. The Foucault book is the other one. Yeah, which has got just sections which are just unacceptable.
You can flip through it and kind of see it.
Yeah. So those are the issues in terms of the quality of the translation. And the other thing I think is just that Deleuze has been a victim of greed, publishing greed. There's so many editions of his work now, 4 or 5 different printings with different page numbers. And this makes it hard to have a shared conversation about the work. Makes it hard. So why not just knock this on the head, just do it, correct the translations, commission new ones, publish them nicely, no fuss. That would make everybody's life easier. Life is hard enough, simply put. So
it would probably be easier on the estate side, but as you said, on the right side, there might be some territoriality, not to bring in really just not even to pun on Deleuze, but there'd be some territorial, as you said, greed being one factor. And because when you said that thought, it was like, oh, well, of course we need that. And I was thinking about, again, Dan Smith and Charles Stovall, who they've spent a lot of time trying to get the seminars together, and potentially talks about publishing as a book. But with technology the way it is, it's nice that it's easy to access. Although I'm sure lots of people too like books. Although I don't know how many volumes that would be. It's maybe only a few, right? 3 or 4. Maybe. But I was thinking something like this, if it could be, Cambridge or whatever. I doubt they care about Deleuze, but who knows? Something like that could go a long way.
Could go a long way, yeah. Bloomsbury has most of the rights, so they're in the position it's feasible in my view.
Yeah.
The 2 times that I've approached them about it, we'll see. That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. I think the one thing I will say about Bloomsbury, and I'm not going to trash them necessarily, but I worry that they, and this is not necessarily an academic thing, but I worry that they are not necessarily ones for critical editions.
No, sure.
But they would have the wherewithal. That's obvious. And it would fit their, obviously the press that I think of that is the powerhouse would be Edinburgh. But, that's, that again, it's a question of rights. They would do it if they had the rights. Yeah.
Blink of an eye.
I'm not a fan of the Bloomsbury stuff at all. I have the translation of libidinal economy from Bloomsbury, and I don't like the binding itself, like just the aesthetics of the book. It's just
right. Like, plus, like, come on, it's libidinal economy. Like, seriously, put some effort in. Good grief.
I have the older Continuum version, but that's the same company under a different name. I like the cover and the binding better, but my concern was more of the direction of editing and taking that seriously. Where I think they're more of a publish as much as possible rather than it's more quantity than quality to get back to market shit. So,
That's right.
But that was something that was interesting, that interested me, and that I thought that was a really, really good idea. And I'm sad to hear that you've already tried to follow through and actualize it. Right. So
maybe times are different. I don't know.
I guess we can't predict the future. Right. That's one thing we've learned. But speaking of future, Jon, we've had a great time discussing and going into the weeds, into the inside baseball and on all of this. I will say that I feel bad that we didn't have time to talk about your book on aphorisms. I had some questions off the top of my head, but I found flipping through those to be fascinating. And I was thinking about the way Deleuze reads Nietzsche's aphorisms, right? The two-sided thing. But what we would like to do, obviously, is extend an invitation to have you back, hopefully around the time when you've got more to say about your forthcoming work, because we've only scratched the surface. And it's really been just a pleasure having you.
It's been great, honestly. I'm sorry that I've been robbed of. I'm now like robbing you of sleep, probably, but
no.
Yeah, it's been great to talk. It's been great to talk. Yeah.
Well,
I'm happy to come back. Yeah.
Oh, great, excellent. And as you said, it's nice to be able to have a forum where you get to talk about these things. You've been cooped up. Sorry, not the pun again. And it's been a delight, and
of course.
This is one of the reasons why we like to do this, and
it's a fantastic forum you got.
I'm so glad you think so. Yeah. But we need to have you back, and we'll let you get the rest of your day started. Hopefully, you've got maybe you've been inspired to write some pages in your new book. What you have at least 2 works you're working on. I guess that would be the last thing. Maybe say a word or two about your future work, and we can close out the show.
That's a good idea. So 4 books. I'm currently
4 books. Okay.
The next market book, which is going to be called Elements of a Continental Philosophy of Economics.
Okay.
The second of the Deleuze volumes. So works of
yes.
Through the book on the American filmmaker Hal Hartley. I don't know if anyone remembers that guy, but I've been putting together a little book. I
had to look him up, so that's something that I'll. Do you have a film to recommend to start with?
If you're going to watch any films to start with, probably watch Henry Fool.
Okay.
He won a Cannes Award for the screenplay for that.
Okay.
Is that the Kenneth Branagh directed?
No. He directs everything himself, right? So
okay, gotcha.
Henry Fool, yeah. And another book of aphorisms, which at the moment, it's easier to write titles for books than actual content. So it's got like 6 or 7 titles, but at the moment it's called Burial at Sea.
Burial at Sea. I like Seduce or Die. Was it Funny or Die? Was that what it's called?
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, maybe think of that, but also maybe think of Baudrillard, obviously Seduction, but it's just like, I also thought of it as self-reflective. It's like either these aphorisms are going to do something for you, or you have to come find me and put me out of my misery.
All of that, that's right. Yeah, that's the great thing about aphorisms. That you can imply several other readings without having to make them explicit,
Yeah.
Unlike philosophy.
I guess the last question would be, is volume 2 going to cover everything post 69, or is it going to, so it's a 2-volume project?
Yeah, this assumes that I'm capable of doing that. I've toyed a few times with breaking it up into 2 pieces. I'm like Achilles and the hare, books get half. I'm putting the Deleuze and Guattari pieces together in 1 volume. That
would be my question. Is it going to be the Deleuze and Guattari? Because it does, but it still spans a long time, so it wouldn't be chronological really anymore. It would be diachronic to a certain extent.
But that doesn't matter, yeah.
That's still almost as many pages as the volumes you covered in volume 1, if you think about it, right? Because even Capitalist Schizophrenia, that's 1,000 pages or so, so that's
it just makes me you're thinking about finishing that 1,000 Plateaus chapter just makes me just quake in terror.
You have to come up with some axioms of inclusion and exclusion. There's got to be like something, unless you pretty much break down each plateau. but that's
complicated. No, I mean, I realize now we've said goodbye and I'm still talking.
No, this is great. This is great. This is what we do. So
I think there is a way of reframing the whole of the book in terms of general ontological claims to more specific analyses.
I like it.
That's one way of, I think, organizing the book. The only thing that gets left out a little bit is the 3 novellas plateau.
And it's sad because that's actually a fun one, right? It's short and sweet. Yeah, I was thinking of you could use Badiou's 4 truth procedures as a although he claims, as you know, that Deleuze doesn't consider politics as having a which I take issue with, but that's not
right. Well, that's definitely something that we should talk about next time.
Yeah, on your book on
point.
Yes. You're sympathetic to Badiou's point. That's okay. Well, that could be something we could hash out.
I think Badiou is a terrible philosopher. Like, inept.
Oh wow!
Philosopher. But
I love it. Oh, we'll leave that on that note. That could be something we talk about again. So expect hearing from us perhaps in the winter time. I'll probably shoot you. Probably around November. That's around our birthday. We're actually born on the same day, by the way, Cooper and I. That's nice. It's star-crossed podcasters, but we'll let you enjoy the rest of your day. And this episode will drop in about 2 weeks, and I'll send you an email, I'll let you know when it's live. And you can, however you can get news out, you can tell your pub friends and your colleagues to come here and shoot the shit.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks again, John.
Tremendous pleasure, John. And once again, thanks to Jon Roffe for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.